My name is Anat Admati, and I am a professor of finance and economics and the faculty director of the Corporations and Society Initiative, CASI, here at the GSB. Engaging the GSB community and others on issues we think are truly important is a key mission of CASI. So I want to welcome all of you and thank you for joining us. And I'd especially like to thank our panelists who flew in to participate in this event. I also want to recognize and thank Dean John Levin for supporting this initiative and for being here today. We and C-SPAN are videotaping this event, so we hope the conversation will continue. CASI focuses on governance issues as they pertain to corporations. How do we ensure that corporations can be trusted to benefit their stakeholders, ultimately society as a whole, without mistreating, deceiving, and harming? How do we ensure that governments write appropriate rules and that corporations comply with those rules? And what are the roles of, among others, employees, customers, investors, courts, and the media in shaping corporations, their culture, and their impact on all of us? In October, we hosted John Carreyrou, the author of Bad Blood, a book about Theranos. Mr. Carreyrou said that one of the grave errors that Theranos CEO Elizabeth Holmes made was to channel the fake it till you make it culture that pervades Silicon Valley. But we have many examples of faking it, also known as fraud, in corporate America, whether it takes the form of misleading investors or customers about your products, opening checking accounts for customers who didn't ask for them, or falsely tweeting that funding has been secured to privatize your company. If corporations have significant power over customers or employees, they can also harm without breaking the law. And if they have political power, they may be able to write the law or get away with breaking it. Successful business leaders often set lofty goals, but we want them to establish and maintain a culture of honesty, including when adversity and challenges arise. We also want them to define success properly and avoid blind spots. By doing so, they can be better leaders, and they will also likely prevent legal troubles, negative publicity, skeptical investors, and public anger. Previous CASI guest, Bethany McLean, who wrote the definitive book on Enron, said, "I think most people in most companies are extremely well-intentioned, but there's a capability in any company, particularly in a world with short-term oriented and bottom-line driven, to go wrong." Some of the subjects of today's conversations have provided almost weekly examples of how things can go wrong. And with Tesla reporting earnings, its CFO departing, and Wells Fargo releasing a report on its reform process, this week was no exception. The issues around corporations and society are complex. We're fortunate to have panelists with us today with amazingly rich and varied experiences and expertise to provide us with some insight. Fahmi Kadir is the Chief Investment Officer of Sefket Capital, a short-only hedge fund based in New York and founded in 2017. Ms. Kadir was featured on the Netflix series Dirty Money for her bet against the troubled drug company Valiant as an equity analyst at the hedge fund Cren Savage Asset Management. More recently, she has taken a short position in Tesla, among others. Emily Glazer is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, where she now covers Wells Fargo and JP Morgan Chase from New York and Los Angeles. Her reporting on Wells Fargo has contributed to public and political backlash against the bank, remedial actions by regulators, and numerous executive departures and changes in business practices. The bank has launched multiple publicity campaigns to regain the public trust. The Honorable Jed Rakoff has been a federal judge in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York for more than 22 years, Prior to joining the federal bench, Judge Rakoff was a federal prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York for 7 years, and then spent 16 years as a white-collar criminal defense lawyer at 2 large New York firms. He has been unusually outspoken for a judge and achieved fame, for example, when he rejected a settlement between the SEC and Citigroup, and when he called the settlement between the SEC and Bank of America half-baked justice. Following this conversation, we'll continue engagement, taking questions from our audience. Now, please join me in thanking again and welcoming our distinguished panelists. I'm going to start by engaging with the panelists, and then we'll open it up. So I'm going to ask them each a question. Maybe I'll get to the second one, and then maybe all of them a question. We'll see how far we get. Depends on the length of the answers, which I hope will be short and to the point. Ms. Kadir, we teach our students that managers must focus on maximizing their company's stock price, and also that for public corporation, the stock price provides good signals of the true value of the corporation's equity. As a short seller, you obviously trade on negative information that others may ignore. With executives wanting to present the rosiest possible picture of disclosures and statements, how does an investor uncover information that the corporation wants to obscure? And what beyond trading do you do with such information?
Thank you, Anat. So the perennial dilemma of the short seller is that the same body of evidence, the publicly available information that management will use to create that rosy narrative, is the same information that I, as a short seller, have to use to disprove the fundamentals of the company or show that there is evidence of fraud. So that's the starting point. So how do we use that information in a different way? And ultimately, for any investor, particularly the skeptical investor, it comes down to asking the right questions. That's really where it all begins. So we're presented with the same exact information, but we are looking at it with a different point of view and asking the critical questions. So every investor, whether it's a short seller or a journalist or a skeptical sell-side analyst, you should really listen to those who are asking the challenging questions, because that will help us see between the lines of the narrative that management is trying to create. To get more into the details, I typically avoid earnings reports. I like to review the balance sheet because understanding the assets and liabilities, that's really what's real about the business and what we can kind of follow the money trail. But earnings and the income statement, the cash flow statement is subject to a lot of manipulation. So we can use that, but again, it's not going to provide the kind of context that we need to understand what's really going on within the business. And then as a short fund with not that much capital, we need to be creative about how we use this information and how we access data and what kind of data we access. So at any point in time, we can assume that there are billion-dollar funds that have access to all of the data. They can pay whatever they want to get the credit card data, the satellite data. So what can I do that is different? Well, I can get away from my computer and I can go out into the world and I can do real-life shoe leather type work, field work. I can engage with the customers of the businesses that I'm looking at, former employees, and most critically, whistleblowers. Again, it's about being creative and gaining that informational edge because you assume that everyone else has the quantitative data. So it's about concatenating, not understanding what management is doing, but also how they behave, how they're responding to those questions, and putting that all together. And when we collect that body of evidence, that gives us some conviction that there's potentially fraud occurring. What do we do with it? Well, as short sellers, we can't simply sit on that information because markets, as much as we would like to think, are not particularly efficient. So sitting on data that is critical to the price discovery of the stock is not, it could lead to me going insolvent. I could definitely lose money as the stocks will continue to go up as the markets will not realize the fraud. So I have to be creative about disseminating that information. So we'll engage with journalists, activists, short sellers, and regulators in order to get the questions out there so investors can think to themselves.
Ms. Glazer, corporations often punish explicitly or implicitly all those who question their desired narrative. Journalists have a key role in exposing gaps between a company's cultivated image and reality. How do you know when to ask more questions, and how do you get answers? And how difficult is it to uncover what's going on and publish material that powerful corporations and their leaders do not want published? What role is the need for access play? Does the need for access play?
So there was a lot that was said that I would agree with. In terms of journalism, I always ask the follow-up question. There are no stupid questions, as much as in my head I think they are. Always better to ask them. And access depends on the situation. So let's take Wells Fargo. Similarly, public information, while very important, and it's extremely important for me to understand earnings reports, I'm not doing my job if I am sitting in the office. I'm constantly out, we call it sourcing in journalism, meeting people that the company does not really want me to meet with. I certainly take meetings that are offered to me, and that's where the access part comes in. It helps working at the Wall Street Journal because we regularly are meeting with CEOs and other executives, and I have that attached to my name. However, the real goods, as we like to call it, and when I do my job well, is writing about something that nobody else knows. And we call that scoops. Scoops are what I live and die by in many ways, and that is through current and former employees, shareholders, a whole variety of them, consultants, advisors, regulators. There are so many different types of people that I need to talk to get a very clear picture of what's going on. Because a company, especially on the communications team, they're trying to paint the most positive picture. I think you said rosy narrative. That's a great way to describe it. But if I'm doing my job as a journalist, I need to understand everything that's going on, and there's often quite a bit that a company might not want us to know about. The other thing that we need to be wary of, especially with Wells Fargo, is that when someone reaches out to me as a journalist, it's usually extremes. It's like a bad game of telephone sometimes. They either love the company or they hate the company. And I need to make sure that I can gut check that with people that I trust. So much of the reporting with Wells Fargo has been about cultivating sources over time, figuring out who I can gut check with, who has a more moderate, fair opinion. I hope that my sources will say, that's not true, that's going too far. And it really makes me rethink the information that I'm gathering so that we can put it out in a fair, objective, and accurate way.
Judge Rakoff, you have prosecuted, defended, and judged individuals and corporations on business and securities fraud cases. How well does our justice system work in a corporate context, where we administer justice to corporations that produce products we buy and employ many people? Do our laws enable holding executives properly accountable for conduct, given the level of control they have and how much deniability, especially of intent, they can claim in court?
So first, I want to say it's a real pleasure to be here. It was hard tearing myself away from the 4-degree above zero weather in New York, but here we are. I'm sorry to have to say that in my view, the prosecution of corporate crime has significantly deteriorated in the United States over the last 20 years. I start with the rather obvious point that inanimate entities like corporations don't themselves commit crimes. It is individuals within the corporation who make the decisions that lead to criminal conduct. And in the period before 2000, the policy of the Department of Justice was to try to discover exactly who those people were at the highest possible levels of responsibility. That was very time-consuming, required a lot of resources, but frankly was quite successful. And so you had the successful prosecution of Mr. Skilling at Enron and Mr. Ebers, the CEO of WorldCom, and Michael Milken in the junk bond scandal, and over 800 people in the savings and loan scandal, going all the way up to the top guy, Charles Keating. Around 2000 or so, the Justice Department's view changed. The nominal reason that they gave for the change, which was to go after companies and not after individuals, was that certain companies had an overly aggressive kind of culture, and that if we really wanted to deter widespread white-collar corporate crime in the long run, we needed to change the culture of these companies through compliance measures and the like. Even on its face, I think that was misguided, and Professor Brandon Garrett, who has done the definitive study of all the corporate prosecutions between 1996 and 2014, has concluded that there was a high rate of recidivism and much less changing corporate culture on the part of those corporations most needing change than it was hypothesized would occur. But I think really the reason the Department of Justice changed its policy was political and also resource management. When you bring a case against a company under federal law, you can invoke what's called the doctrine of respondeat superior, which means that the crime of even the lowest level individual done on behalf of the corporation can be imputed to the corporation. And so corporations in the typical case are dead in the water to begin with. They're going to have to come to a settlement. They're going to have to pay big fines to the government. They're going to have to, with a lot of hoopla, say, we'll never do it again, and the reason is we've put all this compliance measures into place. And that's also politically attractive, and you don't have to spend much of resources at all to realize that result. In theory, you could both go after the corporation and after the individuals. In practice, that doesn't happen because it would be a much more arduous, lengthy process to go after the individuals, and the department feels it can achieve enough, I would say politically, they might say in terms of deterrence, by going after just the companies. I think this is a seriously misguided policy.
Ms. Kadir, Enron CEO Skilling famously used profanity when he was challenged by a short seller on an analyst call. Lehman Brothers CEO Dick Fuld blamed short sellers for his bank's failure, and Elon Musk, most recently, called short sellers value destroyers and criticized skeptical analysts' bonehead questions. How does a skeptical investor deal with the hostility from the company and its cheerleaders?
Well, first and foremost, when I see company management going after journalists or short sellers or anyone asking the difficult questions, that's a red flag, and I'm going to be digging in. So just don't do it. But I think what's most alarming over the past several years, and it's become progressively more obvious, is that the investment community and that those who are going long stocks are increasingly prone to deifying company management, and they can do no wrong. So if you ask the CEO, have you committed fraud, and he tells you, no, I have not, you believe him. You don't ask any further questions. You don't even consider the evidence that is put in front of you, because our decision-making has become so dictated by the stock market and what prices are doing. And we've been in a 10-year bull market, and the prices have just been going up. So we feel that our thesis is being validated by the price action. And typically, yes, when you make money, you can say you're right. But in this case, the real asset value is not really reflected in the price movement. So we can't consider that to be validation. So when we have short sellers or other skeptics coming forward and asking questions, then we should be listening. Because at some point, if you are a true fiduciary and you want to act responsibly with your capital or the capital of others, then you need to consider when is the judicious time to sell. And when someone's asking those tough questions, then you really need to think to yourself, is it almost that time to sell? So just to put this in context of an anecdote, I still am short a short-term health insurer, and I had made about 50% on the position already last year. And I attended their investor day at the end of last year to assess whether it was time for me to cover my position. I'd made significant profit. It seemed almost cheap on an earnings basis. So, maybe it was time to walk away. So I was the only short seller that was apparently there. It was difficult to find out the location of this investor day because it wasn't disclosed to anyone who was asking any questions, even the full investment community itself. And then when I was there, I asked, is this investor event being webcast for the purposes of full disclosure? And they said, no, it is not. So I took out my phone and I was recording the event, so we have a record and I could distribute that to investors as they needed the information. And that phone was, I was warned several times aggressively that I was not allowed to record, and that phone was nearly taken away from me. And then periodically throughout that entire investor day, even though I was sitting quietly in the back of the room, not asking questions, not creating a fuss, the CEO of the company was repeatedly coming back to me and taunting me, bullying me. An investor on the board was passing notes to the CEO, giving him things to say to me, including an invitation to come to the stage in order to engage in some sort of rap battle. I'm not really sure. But throughout the course of this, I'm thinking to myself, okay, I didn't realize it was this bad, so maybe it's not time to cover, maybe it's time to double down. And so I did. So really, in the face, if you have to think to yourself, if you are invested in a company and the executive team decides the best course of action is to humiliate and engage in ad hominem attacks against those asking questions, then even if the skeptic is incorrect in their assertions, is it really a good sign? Is it good character to be engaging in those types of attacks? Is that the kind of person you want running your business and being the safeguard of your capital? I think not. So I think investors who are long have an obligation to engage with the skeptics and put pressure on management. They have their voting rights. As a short seller, I don't have voting rights in a company, but shareholders do. So when those questions come forward, I think investors need to be much more cognizant of the questions being asked and put much more pressure on management.
Thank you. Ms. Glazer, we take this issue very seriously. It has almost become a cliche in corporate public relation to respond to reports about scandals, the scams themselves. Yet often they change little, we heard from the judge, without pressure from the outside. Wells Fargo is now moving to its second post-crisis rebranding. Instead of re-established, we now have This is Wells Fargo. How serious do you think the issue is of executives and boards diagnosing problems, thinking of them as just public relations problems, and that's what it's all about? And then how do you as an outside investor sort of know whether they actually are just making cosmetic changes or really sort of changing?
First, I just wanted to address something that Judge Rakoff mentioned in terms of sometimes the settlements and how things shake out and what happens from there. It reminded me of covering big banks during a large foreign exchange settlement in 2015 when they finally pleaded guilty and the stock prices went up. So just wanted to mention that. So culture. It's this very amorphous topic, and when a company says we're changing our culture, we're doing this, we're doing that, we have new ad campaigns, it's very hard for journalists. It's really difficult to write about something like culture that doesn't have metrics attached to it all the time. So what I try to look for are specifics that are actually show change. Now, one of the things that I noticed with Wells Fargo was right from the start, and for several months after, their top executives said, we do not have a culture problem. Everything is great here. It's a certain part of the bank. They're different. Our CEO is from the wholesale part of the bank. He never touched retail bank. That was the new person they brought in to change. And from there, we saw problem after problem after problem. I thought my job would calm down after a little while. In fact, when I started covering big banks, JP Morgan Chase and Wells Fargo, I was told focus 70-ish% on JP Morgan, 30%-ish or so on Wells Fargo. That obviously was changed dramatically. And I thought things would calm down. You know, the September 2016 scandal reported nonstop for a couple months, and then we thought, okay, we're coming out of the woods. But then more and more and more happened. And that leads you to question, what is going on with the culture? What I can say is right now, I do listen to what the executives say, and a big comment coming from the CEO, Timothy Sloan of Wells Fargo, and the Chief Financial Officer, John Shrewsbury, is that these are legacy problems. When the Federal Reserve slapped Wells Fargo with an unprecedented enforcement action capping the bank's growth in February, actually it was a year ago, how time flies, in February 2018, the bank made it very clear these are old issues, nothing is new. Same happened when the OCC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau had a settlement with the bank for $1 billion. Nothing is new, these are old legacy problems. I did make a little cheat sheet of some new problems that I've written about that happened in 2017 and 2018, and so I'm constantly wondering, are these old problems? Employees added Social Security numbers and other customer financial personal information when they were doing anti-money laundering controls and checks that happened in 2017 and 2018. We just wrote about a regulatory warning to the bank about their technology oversight for more than 24 open regulatory warnings known as matters requiring attention. That's from 2018. Their wealth management problems, which we wrote about, definitely covered 2017. That investigation is also still open. I should add the Department of Justice is investigating the AML issues, OCC on tech, foreign exchange problems that happened through 2017. So I could keep going, but that all leads me to think, how much is the culture changing? What is new and what is old? Why are the scripted responses still the same? And for a journalist, it makes me want to keep probing and keep asking the questions. And when they say they're taking the issue seriously, I just look at the facts.
Great. Judge Rakoff, lawyers and consultants now seem to have taken responsibilities to investigate, diagnose problems, and propose remedies. These are in the private sector. You describe the ecosystem as an attempt to rehabilitate the company's culture. The investigations and reports by Wells Fargo Bank are one example. And overseeing settlements also outsourced to lawyers and consultants. What's your view of how well this system of corporations investigating and rehabilitating themselves work? Does this process serve the interests of shareholders and the broader goal of justice in the corporate context?
So I first want to say that I do not want to comment about Wells Fargo, and nothing I say should be taken as reflective of that. Under federal law, I'm precluded from commenting on any matter that is still in any respect ongoing. And in any event, with Emily here, I don't need to comment. The corporate prosecution approach that I described before has proven very lucrative to certain institutions or organizations, all, of course, at the expense of shareholders who virtually always have nothing to do with the underlying misconduct. So, whereas in the old days, prosecutors and people at the SEC and so forth would undertake arduous, lengthy, difficult investigations of alleged corporate malfeasance, now what happens is that the prosecutor will allay a subpoena on the company having heard about some problem, and the company will have a outside counsel, almost always a former prosecutor from the very same office, come visit and say, we're prepared to investigate this, we want to do the right thing, we want to cooperate, don't feel you need to spend any time or money on this. We will get you the answers. We'll do a thorough investigation and report back to you in 6 or 9 months with the results. And it's very hard for the prosecutor to say no to that offer. Those are very lucrative assignments. I'm told that in the Siemens case, the total investigation netted fees to Debevoise and Plimpton of $3 billion. And if you want to know why they hired Mary Jo White, now you know. But that's just the start, because after the council comes back and says, oh, we've cleaned up our act, council will almost always propose a bunch of new compliance measures to create a better culture and make sure that this never happens again. And the government will maybe up the ante and say, no, that's not enough. We need still further compliance measures. And that's a very expensive proposition. It typically exists over several years. It involves people both hired by the company and people from outside who the company has to pay for. And all of this, again, comes out of the pockets of the innocent shareholders. So there is a strong economic motive pushing this kind of approach, and yet, to repeat what I mentioned earlier, all the most careful studies suggest that it doesn't accomplish that much. There are cases, Pfizer is the sort of poster child here. Pfizer went through 4 different deferred prosecution agreements and broke each one of them, each time announcing that, oh, today we've put in place compliance measures that will prevent us from ever doing anything wrong again. And when finally the government had no choice but to bring a full-fledged prosecution, they rightly were concerned about the fact that they didn't want to put Pfizer out of business, which would have been very unfair to not only the shareholders, but to the many employees who had nothing to do with the misconduct. And so the actual guilty plea was entered by a shell subsidiary of Pfizer, so that only the shell was put out of business and not the company as a whole. And these are the kinds of dilemmas you face when you go down this road, as opposed to if you were going after a high-level executive. No company is going to fold because a high-level executive was prosecuted and went to jail. And yet the deterrent effect on other high-level executives of his or her going to jail is, in my view, quite substantial.
I'm going to ask you just a couple more questions of the whole panel, anybody who wants to respond. Wells Fargo's board report described former CEO John Stumpf as by nature an optimistic executive. And Ken Lay from Enron was also described as optimistic type. What's the line between naive optimism and willful blindness? The desire by executives not to see or hear about problems, just thus conveying an implicit message that people should cover up problems and not bring them up. So how do people then in watchdogs and boards, some of this was covered by your previous answer, strike the right balance between skepticism and this optimism?
I don't think that skepticism and optimism are on 2 different sides of the coin. I think they're the exact same thing. If in order to believe in the long-term prospects of a company, you need to be skeptical about what management is doing. And I think we, at this point in history, face this problem where investors seem to equate the success of the business to the success of the executive. And we are too dependent on the CEO founders. I think this is probably due to the rise of technology companies in Silicon Valley, where we expect that CEO founder to have all of the power within the company as far as just making the decisions, and there are no checks and balances. And we applaud those executives when they surround themselves with employees that are yes men, with boards that are yes men, and no one really wants to take accountability anymore. It's really down to, whatever the executive wants because he or she is a genius, that they are the best suited to make decisions for a publicly traded organization, which I think is terribly unwise. So I think we need to return to a time where all of those individuals, whether the auditors, the members of the board, the investors, they all need to realize what are their separate duties in this financial system. And they need to not act as pawns of the executive management, but really they need to act independently and take accountability for the decisions that are made. Because ultimately, if the executive makes fraudulent decisions, then everyone's going down.
I would just add 2 quick points to that. I think experience is necessary, but when you surround yourselves with the same people year in and year out, whether management or the board, you're not getting fresh perspective. I'll bring it back to Wells Fargo. So did a little math on the train ride over here, or looked at some numbers on the proxy, I should say. And their 2016 proxy, which covered the 2015 year, there were 9 directors on their board that served between 5 and 15 years. That's a very long tenure. You need to have a lot of, they call it, fresh blood on the board. And the bank has since added, I believe, 6 new directors since the scandal kind of became public. They also touted, and a lot of companies do this as well, I shouldn't just say Wells Fargo, covered Procter & Gamble when an activist investor came in, Herbalife when an activist investor came in, some other companies. This insular culture of management that have served 20 plus years together and grown up together. And if you aren't bringing in outsiders who are really questioning the status quo, and you have what turns into yes men without even realizing it, that's when these problems can just continue growing, even without people noticing it.
So I'm not sure that it's a question of optimism or pessimism. As an American, I am, of course, a born optimist. As a Jew, I am, of course, a born pessimist. But the doctrine, the legal doctrine of conscious disregard, willful disregard, requires that you intentionally close your eyes to what is there to be seen. It's not just that you're off in a cloud and you should be more down to earth. It requires that you purposely say, I don't want to hear that, or Joe, you take care of that, don't tell me about it. My experience as a prosecutor was that this was extremely common at high levels in certain areas. A lot of accounting fraud, I think, fits that kind of situation. But that's what's required, and the government cannot either criminally or even civilly succeed on a willful disregard, conscious disregard theory unless they can show that you purposely turn yourself away from what was there clearly to be seen.
My final question to the whole panel. It was the LA Times and not any regulator or prosecutor that broke the Wells Fargo account scandals. The Federal Reserve took almost 17 months after the full scope of the scandal became public to take any action, and that's a key regulator for bank holding companies. For Tesla, Elon Musk has repeatedly insulted the SEC both before and after settling securities fraud charges with them. Various media reports about unsafe working conditions in Tesla just recently resulted in California issuing 6 citations for a fine of $30,000. Are regulators doing their jobs? What messages are these agencies sending to the market and to the public with these action or lack of action?
Well, it's increasingly alarming that we live in a world where regulations are being rolled back. Key organizations that protect consumers and the public are being disarmed. And investors are sort of just standing by and allowing it to occur. And regulators, again, are almost rolling over. They're under-resourced, and there's so much fraud in the markets. How do you even, A, have the time to spend to prosecute, and do you have enough evidence to be able to prosecute for criminal corporate behavior? And it's an increasingly difficult job. So nothing is more effective than the court of public opinion. And as a short seller, I found we interact with regulators, but it'll often take years for them to even initiate investigations. And we'll send all of our work, and they'll collect thousands and thousands of pages of documents evidencing crime and potential fraud, but they can't do anything. And I'm not sure whether it's because they simply can't, or if there's some element of regulatory capture. But at least with journalists, you can publicly shame these companies and
objectively and accurately write about these companies.
And then the average person who's reading these articles is then better aware. Investors are better aware, and they can make more judicious financial decisions and consumer decisions. But just this week, so we are short a company called Wirecard based out of Germany, and the Financial Times has come out with a series of incredible investigative reports this week indicating fraud and criminal money laundering at this German bank, Wirecard. And within minutes of the publications coming out, the company itself comes out saying that the reports are defamatory, denying all claims. And then within less than a day of those reports coming out, the German public prosecutor comes out and says that they don't believe there to be any wrongdoing occurring at this company, Wirecard. And then shortly after that, BaFin, the German securities regulator, says they are launching a market manipulation probe into the trading around Wirecard. So in the US, I think we haven't reached that point of regulatory capture, but I think there needs to be faith restored in our regulation and the corporate system, because we just simply aren't seeing corporate prosecutions anymore. And there's no moment of comeuppance where these executives are engaged in such high levels of crime. Investors aren't holding them to account. The justice system isn't holding to the account. So who is?
I would just add a couple quick points. I have a feeling you might want to respond to that. But are regulators doing their jobs? Yes, they still are. I think sometimes the amounts of the fines, especially over the years, can really dictate how much attention is given. When Bank of America paid a $16.65 billion fine, it was the largest of the time related to crisis-era problems, that kind of set this number. With Wells Fargo, they've paid about $4 billion so far collectively since 2016. Are there problems better or worse than Bank of America and the mortgage crisis? I'll let you guys decide. I mean, my job is presenting the information and doing it in a fair and accurate way. However, what I will say is there are a lot of outstanding issues. I think you mentioned before how long some of these investigations take. Tesla, for instance, is still under criminal investigation. So while there was a $30,000 settlement, just pennies to these companies, I'm curious what might happen with the criminal investigation. With Wells Fargo, there's still an open and pretty multifaceted Department of Justice and SEC separate investigations going on. So we have to wonder, okay, what will happen there? And I think sometimes regulators try to self-correct a little bit. When you mentioned the Pfizer example before, Judge Rakoff, it did remind me a little bit of Wells Fargo, which had this ongoing dialogue with the Fed and the OCC about fixing its risk management system, which is how it's supposed to find and prevent problems. They kept going back and forth again and again, extended deadline, submit, extended deadline. Oh, we're not going to fail you, but we're giving you language that might make you realize that you need to resubmit the risk framework. This has gone on and on and on. The risk framework is still not approved, by the way. This is many years later, so it's not quite the same as a deferred prosecution agreement, but how much give and take is there? The Fed finally had this unprecedented enforcement action and really showed its strength there right on Janet Yellen's last day. So I think we have to give the regulators credit. It's how long it takes, what happens, and sometimes the amount of the fine that helps us understand the context around it.
So I had a conversation about a week ago with Jeff Berman, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. He probably thought this was a private conversation, but in the confidence of the C-SPAN broadcast, I will relay it. He was complaining that the U.S. Attorney's Office was receiving fewer criminal referrals from the SEC than in prior years. And by the way, both he and I have a great respect for the SEC, and there are 100 different reasons this might have occurred. So I don't want to make too much out of it. But I said to him, well, what are you going to do about it? And he said, oh, I've already taken a step. I have arranged for each member of the fraud unit, that's the unit that prosecutes these matters, to receive each morning a copy of the Wall Street Journal. So
Thank you
there's
so
the
much for
solution.
saying that. I did not give Judge Rakoff any financial anything. No gifts were exchanged in this panel.
Okay, I want to now leave time, 15 minutes or a little more than that, to audience questions. So please raise your hand. Unfortunately, we do not need mics, so you can just go ahead and speak.
Yeah.
But please speak
Yeah,
up.
my name is Mayank Misra. I'm a GSB student here in the MSX program. And Judge Rakoff, I wanted to ask you this question on, it's more of a system question, is there's the possibility of getting a settlement with the SEC without admitting or denying guilt incentivize the companies to sort of bake it in as cost of doing business?
So this policy goes back to the 1970s. I think it's a misguided policy, but let me tell you what its rationale is. It arose in the context of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act problem before there was a statute. Most American, or many American companies were paying bribes. And the SEC said, we think that was a violation of the securities laws because you didn't disclose it. So there was a failure to disclose. But we sort of understand that Congress had not yet acted at the time you did this. So we will allow you to settle without admitting or denying. And the reason that was important to the company, and the reason it's still important to the company, is class actions. They do not want to be in the position of having admitted something that will then lead to there being, as we say in the law, collaterally estopped from denying it in the corresponding class action. So it's all about class actions and the very large exposure that they typically will find in a class action. The SEC goes along with it because it makes settlements so much easier. And so it's just, again, a resource saving mechanism for them. The problem I have with it is that no one ever knows the truth. So here you have the SEC and their complaints saying they did all sorts of bad things. Here you have the company not admitting or denying. In the old days, the next day they would issue a press release saying we deny, but we settled because it was a cost of doing business. The SEC then put in a gag rule, which I've also criticized as, I think, perhaps violative of the First Amendment, where you can no longer, if you're the company, you don't have to admit anything, but you can't deny it after you sign these deals. So I'm told, I don't know if this is true, that what company now does is they leak the denial to the Wall Street Journal. But the public, in these very important cases, has an interest in knowing what the truth is. And the effect of these settlements is that you never know what the truth is. Now, settlements are a good thing as a general matter, but there are cases and cases. And when an important claim is made by a government agency that you committed massive fraud that has cost investors and the public generally millions, even billions of dollars, and the public never knows whether that was a fair accusation or an unfair accusation, that I think is not a good way to proceed.
George?
Whether executive compensation and the nature of it, the size of it, the methodology of it, whether it's formulaic or not, is a huge early warning signal. in the sorts of problems of fraud and misrepresentation and destruction of value that you've talked about?
I'll take a first stab at that. I think it's a great question. What we've seen, and this really goes back to corporate governance and the role of the board in many cases, because they are dictating how top management are paid, and at large companies, that's millions, if not tens of millions of dollars. What we've seen, especially in the banking industry, is that there are more and more often CEOs or C-level executives are paid in performance shares that vest over time, usually a couple of years at least. What I've seen with Wells Fargo, and I do want to give them credit where credit is due, it came up in the report that was more than 100 pages released earlier this week, is that they have significantly changed how they compensate executives. Clawbacks are also key with companies. Sometimes they're public, sometimes they're private. I love writing about them when they're private. I think it's very interesting to find out how much money was clawed back from executives. That happened with JP Morgan Chase and the London Whale. The head of the investment office was clawed back significant amounts of her compensation. At Wells Fargo, they've had, I want to get this number right, tens of millions of dollars, I'll be on the safe side, in clawbacks, but I know there are more private ones that I'm still trying to figure out. And another way that compensation has also changed comes back to companies adding a risk management component in performance evaluations. I think this is key because a lot of times these scandals, as the media likes to call them, but these are very serious issues, sometimes fraudulent, will come up and an executive has already been paid and then retires, just leaves. And so we did notice that with Wells Fargo as well, and in part because of the regulator, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, there has been a limitation on golden parachutes. So if you just retire and leave and you haven't been fired, you can't just get millions and millions of dollars anymore.
I would only add one thing, which is, while you are right that compensation is a major component of this mix, other changes can often be equally or of greater significance. For example, when I was a kid, bankers were sort of the sleepy-eyed people of the world, very conservative, and then Glass-Steagall was repealed, and the bankers became, as a class, much more aggressive because they were really in a different kind of business. So the changes like that could also be important.
Following up on the last question, hearkening back to the Disney case when Michael Eisner fired Michael Ovitz for very poor performance over the course of a year, and he walked away with $140 million in severance, which 20 years ago was actually big money. And the case led to a suit in the Delaware Chancery Court, and I want to ask about the role of the judge in these types of litigation, because the judge there wrote an opinion saying, well, Eisner has come forward and said there was no basis for denying him the compensation because we couldn't have fired him for cause, even though there was spectacular evidence in the trial that Ovitz had repeatedly lied. So documentary evidence, and Sid Bass, who was a 25% shareholder of Disney at the time, rehearsed many of these lies. And the judge ignored it all and said, Eisner has come forward and said there was no basis for termination for cause, and that's how the case then ended. A different judge, I think, would have at least highlighted all of the evidence of dishonesty, and I think sending a message to the corporate world that dishonesty will be disregarded is a dangerous message.
Well, I certainly don't want to comment on whether the judge got it right or wrong in that case. The Delaware Court of Chancery, a very important court in corporate matters, is unusual in the Anglo-American setup because it's not a jury situation. It's a judge who's making most of the factual determinations, whereas in most cases, in most courts in the United States, it's the jury that makes the final determinations. Also, something that is somewhat unique to the Anglo-American system, which is that factual findings are subject to very limited review on appeal. They can only be reversed for clear error. Whereas in most European systems, a higher court can say, we've looked at the record and we just don't agree. And we come out on the facts differently than the lower court. So I think there is built into our system perhaps too much deference to the district courts and the lower courts. I say that, of course, the big exception being my decisions. But I think that there is a little bit of an institutional problem there, but I can't comment on the specific case.
Judge Rakoff, it strikes me that there are maybe 100 different ways that the courts are skewed in favor of large corporations. And I mean, to start with arbitration, which is concealed from the public, and the Delaware Court of Chancery costs $20 just to search for a case, let alone get a document, which I realize is not your court. But what can actually be done in the Southern District of New York today, right now, to start to reverse that trend? Is there anything? Are there any pilot projects? Because I've looked and I don't see a whole lot going on, and we all kind of know the situation that we're in, but it seems, is there just a lack of willpower? What is going on there?
Well, I think you're raising more than one question there. If your assertion is that the courts are biased in favor of companies, I actually don't think that's true. But if what you're talking about is access to the courts, that's a huge problem. But it's much more a problem for everyday folks having everyday legal problems. The problem here is that the legal profession, which we call it a profession, but it's actually economically a cartel, has priced itself out of the price range that most Americans can afford. And the statistics are really quite shocking. In family court and housing court, which are the two courts that everyday Americans most get involved in sooner or later, over 2/3 of the individuals are not represented by lawyers at all. They make enough so that they can't be given appointed lawyers, but they don't make enough to actually afford a lawyer. They lose cases in those two courts at a 500% greater rate than people who are represented by lawyers. So it makes it's case dispositive in most cases. I think there are two solutions for certain basic legal things. I think online legal services is definitely something that can improve the situation. I would like to see in the legal profession what are the equivalent in the medical area of nurse practitioners, legal technicians who wouldn't require 3 years of law school. I don't think you need 3 years of law school anyway, but would have a certain amount of training and a certain apprenticeship, and then could do basic skills like go into family court and to housing court and represent them. That's a different point than what you're talking about, but it is, I think, maybe one of the single greatest legal problems in the United States.
One last question, Alexis.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm a first-year MBA student, and I'm coming at this from having worked at the CFPB as well as for a bunch of large financial players. So my question is, some of the stories that we probably don't hear about are those situations where these types of scandals and difficult decisions we learn about in the classroom are actually handled well. And I'm wondering if, from your perspectives, you have any examples of where executives are actually approaching these from what you think are particularly responsible actions in the face of very difficult decisions, and those either stories we have seen or those that don't come up that we don't get to see.
I'll use Wells Fargo as an example because there have been a number of different problems that have come open in different ways, and I think in the 2 years and roughly 4 months since the sales practices problems occurred, they have change the way that they acknowledge problems, come forth with what they are not doing, and engage, and are trying to be more transparent. So I think you can see companies evolve over time, especially when they're on the hot seat. I have to keep thinking about companies that have done it very well. I'll come back to you on that. I don't know if either of you can weigh in.
Well, I want to say a more general thing, which is I think it is beyond question that American business people as a whole are far more honest than in a great many countries of the world. I just had a case that settled a few months ago called In Re Petrobras, which was a class action based on what had occurred in Brazil. And the corruption there was just endemic throughout, not just the company itself, but other companies who were its suppliers, the government of Brazil. The whole thing was just totally corrupt from top to bottom. You don't see that in the United States, thank God. So we have lots of problems which we've been discussing, but I don't want to neglect to put this in the broader perspective that American business people as a whole, I think, have much to be proud of.
And to follow on the judge's comments, I think a lot of that has to do with corporate transparency in the United States. I think the reporting requirements in the US are just much more stringent than outside of the US, at least at the public company level. But there have been movements now within the SEC to question whether or not we need quarterly reporting. But I think investors need to really press and ask the companies that they're invested with for more information. And when questions do arise, judicious companies, and they do exist. Not all companies that commit fraud are doing so intentionally. Sometimes you're between a rock and a hard place. Your fundamentals are deteriorating. You're in a difficult business cycle. So you'll bring in outsiders to investigate the company, and then you actually will make that report public to your investors, so they can then assess whether or not the problems are resolved. So again, it really comes down to transparency in the United States, which is again much greater than the rest of the world.
I want to thank you all for being here. Thanks for the panel. And have a great afternoon. Thank you.